The boy with the yellow eyes. Only a handful of the residents of Preston Heights recall the actual events, and even then, years and conflicting accounts have clouded the facts. Still, in some quarters, and especially during the relentless winters unique to the hillside village, the incident is spoken of with pride and awe. Till today, if you get a couple of old-timers in the same room, a heated debate will erupt over the mundane detail of whether Norman was 10 or going on 13. They'll also argue whether he lost one shoe or both in the scuffle. What the parties do agree on is that what happened in Preston Heights, and it involved Norman and his next-door neighbor Willie, whose age for some reason is never questioned, 13. And, of course, the stranger. Opinions are equally divided on whether the stranger's limp was caused by a deformed right or left leg. But everyone, to a person, can tell you exactly what the Vice President of the United States was wearing when he arrived and what he ordered for lunch. In fact, his discarded gingham cloth napkin, since laundered, is part of the local exhibit, which includes his signature in the hotel's register. The only other point of total agreement is that Norman was the least likely of heroes. He had none of the qualities that could have foretold his sudden fame. Norman was not the kind of kid who would cause you to break out in a grin if you saw him ride your way on a bike. 1, he couldn't ride a bike. 2, he rarely emerged from his house. And 3, he was considered, weird. This last opinion was based on the fact that Norman would only be seen heading toward or leaving the library, and always hugging an armful of books. To the town folk it seemed awfully unhealthy for a young boy to read so much. They predicted a total loss of eyesight by the time he reached 19. Willie, however, was a kid who had there been a normal kid pageant, would have won first and tied for second and third. A dynamic baseball player, daring bike rider, crackerjack newspaper delivery boy, he was the town's delight. Never mind that he was flunking all school subjects and had a reputation as a bully. He was, after all, a real boy. The differences did not escape the boys themselves. Though neighbors, separated only by splintery bushes, they never so much as shared a high. To Willie, Norman was simply the kid with the yellow eyes. Not that they were actually yellow, more of a hazel brown, but often, the way the sunlight bounced off the thick glasses, it seemed to create a yellow haze. Years later, in a rare interview, Norman was asked if he had missed having friends while growing up. He replied, "Not at all. I had Huck and Tom Sawyer." To Norman, Willie was exhausting. He talked fast, ran fast, walked fast, and, he suspected, even slept fast, if such a thing could be measured. It was tiring just to sit behind him in class and listen to his endless chatter. If Norman was slow motion, Willie was definitely fast forward, which brings us to the stranger, who fits somewhere in between. Some say the stranger arrived early one summer day on foot. Others believe he came on the bus from Boulder. One fact is undisputed. He took a room on the second floor of McClory's Hotel. Not that he had much of a choice. It was the only lodging in town. The hotel dated back to the construction of the first railroad. It had been hastily thrown together to house the army of laborers that would lay the train tracks. Unfortunately, the hilly terrain steamed the workforce, and the project was eventually abandoned, leaving the 3 passenger and 2 freight cars. George McClory, the town's undertaker, purchased the hotel and soon found he could make more money by housing the living. The hotel parlor soon became the common milling ground. Here you could always get into a game of checkers, buy stamps, mail a letter, or receive news of neighboring towns via the traveling salesman. That's why when the stranger first arrived, his presence went almost unnoticed. It was only after he was still visible after a period of weeks that others became aware of him. A tall, muscular man in his 30s with a ready smile, he made a favorable impression. Maybe it was the limp. Many attributed it to the war when raging in Europe. Too polite to inquire, the hotel regulars silently accepted his wound. Since the man was never seen during the day and rarely till after supper, his comings and goings drew much speculation. Local gossip had it that he was an artist who'd come to Preston Heights to paint the unusual terrain. This theory was fueled by the sight of the man always carrying a dark satchel. Some held that the man was famous. Perhaps that legend would have endured except for 3 insignificant, unrelated events. 1. The library decided to paint its reading room. 2. Willie's baseball coach had a tooth pulled. And 3. The stranger overslept. On the day of the incident, Norman headed as usual to the library. Mrs. Brenner, the librarian, met him at the entrance and explained that due to the clean-up work the library was temporarily closed. The thought of studying in his stuffy bedroom (no air could circulate because of all the books he ordered from Chicago and New York publishers) sent him instead to the railroad yards. The discarded railroad cars, which had been painted a zippy burgundy when new, now bore the scars of merciless winters and oppressive summers. Vandalism and neglect had added to the toll. For too many years kids had deemed it their own amusement park. In recent time the decaying cars had even been abandoned by the vandals. Rumor had it that rats and raccoons openly roamed the burgundy cars. Norman knew it wasn't true. At least once a month, when the weather was nice, he would head for the railroad yard, lugging his books, to settle comfortably in a cushioned seat in car number 7215. His head pressed against the wooden window frame, now painless. When the day's shadow hit the bottom of the page, he knew to close the book and head home. On this day, the high position of the sun assured him of at least 4 uninterrupted hours of reading. Across town, in the schoolyard, Willie stood with his friend swinging his baseball bat in the air. He looked forward to practice almost as much as to the games. That's why, when the coach appeared to say he had to cancel due to an impacted tooth, the teenager found himself at a loss as to what to do. It was too early to start his newspaper money collection. Knowing it was best to strike when families were seated for dinner, he wandered aimlessly toward the rail yards with a mind to picking up some chunky rocks and using them as balls to swat about the empty field. And so it was that he found himself in the proximity of car number 7215. The unusually warm weather had its effect on the stranger, who now dozed in the freight car, an iron length away from number 7215. The heat had caused him to discard his usual caution in return for a slight breeze. He had lifted the huge steel doors that slid upward, affording him a welcome breeze from the quiet countryside. The cool air had lulled his senses, stretching his customary nap long past its normal half-hour. Perhaps it was his 2 months of success, his feeling of invincibility, or his unconscious desire for danger that caused him to be careless this day. In any event, when he awoke he did not bother to lower the steel door. He opened his black satchel and removed the network of tubes, cylinders, wires, bolts, and antennas, which he expertly positioned in a matter of minutes. It was now an automatic labor. His mind refreshed by sleep, he thought ahead to the coming week when he would be safely aboard the steamer that would carry him across the ocean. The lightness of his touch as he twisted the spidery wires reflected his carefree attitude. Norman's first reaction was to ignore Willie's sudden entrance. "Did you see my ball go by here?" Norman didn't even look up from the book he was reading. "No, not exactly a ball, more like a rock," Willie said, sitting on the armrest of a seat, with his legs blocking the aisle. "No," Norman answered. Normally, Willie would have stalked out, but it was cooler inside the car, and most appealing of all, Norman looked so relaxed and comfortable that he felt compelled to ruin it. "What are you doing, anyway?" "Reading." "I figured that. That's all you ever do. Aren't you going to lose your eyesight?" Norman's lack of response did not still Willie. "I think reading is dumb." "I think hitting a rock with a stick is dumb." "Oh, yeah? You ever try it?" "No. You ever try reading?" When the teacher makes me. I'd rather hit a rock. It's fun." So is reading. Willie didn't buy it. "When I hit a ball, I'm doing something. Reading is not doing." Norman removed his glasses and closely regarded Willie with his full attention. "Do you know what I was doing when you barged in here? I was running through a haunted castle being chased by a vampire who is very, very thirsty. If that isn't doing, I don't know what is." This led to Norman's explaining the plot of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Willie, totally engrossed, sat on the floor listening to the tale of horror. Norman was telling him about Renfield and his daily diet of spiders and insects when a distant clicking sound diverted his attention. "Probably a woodpecker," Willie said, urging the other boy to get back to the story. Norman stretched his neck closer to the sound. "If it is, it's the smartest woodpecker in history," Norman said, straining to hear. Something in Norman's expression caused Willie to whisper, "What are you talking about?" Norman swiftly signaled him to be quiet and silently crept toward the source of the tapping. Willie, suddenly frightened for reasons he could not explain, followed closely. "What is it?" he asked, gripping his baseball bat. The tapping was louder now. "It's coming from the freight car." Norman dropped to the floor, his body hunched against the steel door separating them from the other car. Willie fell alongside him. "What is it?" he half pleaded. Norman took a pencil from his pocket and began scribbling furiously on the margins of the library book. Willie noticed that he wrote with the rhythm of the clicking sound. Whenever the tapping stopped for a moment, so did Norman's pencil. Willie glanced at the jottings, but it was difficult to make out the words. He did make out one short phrase. "End is near." Norman and the clicking stopped at the same time. "What does it mean?" Willie whispered, his fear growing. He had known fear once before, when a stray dog, foaming at the mouth, had cornered him behind the general store. But this was worse. Here the threat was unknown. Norman quickly stashed the book under a seat and jumped to his feet. "We have to stop him," he told Willie. "Who?" "The spy," Norman said, as he slid open the heavy door and dashed outside. A startled Willie sat frozen. The bright sun slammed Norman in the face as he jumped from the train car and rolled underneath the freight compartment. He was silently happy to see Willie join him seconds later. "What are we doing?" Willie asked, frightened of the answer. "Waiting." "For what?" he whispered. "Him," Norman said, pointing to the underbelly of the rusted car. Before Willie could reply, the stranger jumped from above their heads, clutching his dark suitcase. They watched as his limping form started to move away. Norman sprang from under the car, raced after the man, and, to Willie's horror, tackled him from behind. The satchel went flying in the surprise attack. "Grab it! Grab it!" Norman screamed. The stranger clawed the ground and struggled to his feet, fighting like a wild man. His eyes were ablaze with hate. His arms, hands, and feet spun like a deranged windmill. His actions were swift, but Norman was quicker. Try as he might to grab the boy, the man kept slashing at the air. He managed to clutch the boy's foot, but Norman quickly wiggled out of his shoe. The man grabbed him by his pants leg and pulled him to the ground. "Do something!" Norman screamed at Willie, who stood paralyzed with fear. The man was now crouched over the boy's body and was gripping his neck. Willie, seeing Norman's legs thrash helplessly in the air, swung his baseball bat with all his strength and caught the stranger, low and inside. "About time!" Norman coughed, massaging his throbbing neck. Hours later, sitting in the hotel lobby with the chief of police, the boys watched warily as swarms of people dashed up and down the stairs. They knew the man's room was being torn apart. In the hotel kitchen, the stranger was surrounded by FBI agents who had been summoned from the state capital, Denver, 78 miles away. More were en route from Washington, D.C. By nightfall, the hotel was completely isolated from the public, and everyone heard of how Willie and Norman had caught themselves a real-life Nazi spy. It took weeks for the full story to emerge, and even then the citizens felt that the whole story would never be revealed. Norman's Dracula book, for instance, had been whisked away by agents. What was learned was that the man had been transmitting information to a colleague in Boulder. That man had managed to slip away and was now believed to be back in Berlin. Two of the stranger's conspirators in New York, one a woman, were arrested and being held in a federal prison outside of Virginia. 3 months later, in a highly publicized visit, the Vice President of the United States came to Preston Heights to thank the boys personally. Film crews shot footage of the unlikely trio that would be shown in movie theaters throughout the country. Preston Heights would never be the same. The cameras were there when Norman was asked how he'd been able to understand the Morse code. "I learned it from a book," he said. Asked how he had been able to overpower the man, Willie grinned. "Easy. I'm batting .409 on the school team." Preston Heights blossomed under the glare of national attention. Tourists visiting the state made it a point to spend the night at McCory's Hotel and gawk at the corner table in the dining room, where the vice president ate lunch with the boys and their parents. Willie did not go on to become a major league slugger. Instead, he left Preston Heights to join the Navy and rose into the rank of Chief Petty Officer upon retirement. Norman attended Georgetown University and went on to serve as press secretary for a New Jersey senator. Every Christmas they exchange cards and a list of books each has read during the previous year. Norman is still ahead of Willie, 2-1.